in the Asia Pacific. My name is Tom Latimer and I'll be your host for today's session. In terms of legislation, it's quite a pivotal time at the minute, obviously with Australia close to releasing ASRS requirements, other jurisdictions adopting other frameworks, the likes of ISSB, IFRS, even CSRD. So there's certainly a lot of acronyms that have been thrown around the place, which I know can be confusing. So hopefully today's session over the next 45 minutes, we can provide some clarity that will help you guide your organization's sustainability program. It's just a bit of a housekeeping. Initially, you'll see there's a chat box on the right-hand side. So as we're going through today's session, if you've got any questions, feel free to pop them in that chat. There's also some polls that will appear throughout the session on the right-hand side as well, but we will leave sort of 10-15 minutes towards the end for Q&A session as well. So for those that are not familiar with SocialSuite, we are a sustainability and advisory technology organization based here in Melbourne. I had the pleasure of helping hundreds of organizations through materiality up through to disclosure reporting, primarily in the APAC region. We're also joined today as well by our Chief Impact Officer, Dr. Tim Siegenbeek van Heukelom. As I said, he's the Chief Impact Officer here at SocialSuite. And if you've watched previous sessions, you'll be familiar with this face from other webinars. But if you do want to catch up on previous sessions, we do host them on our website. We do also have a YouTube channel as well. So if there's anything about materiality or the types of reporting that you'd want to learn about, feel free to jump on the website as well. So just before I hand across to Tim, I just want to bring up a poll on the right-hand side. Just keen to understand where organizations on this webinar are at from a sustainability journey perspective, just to help guide the conversation a little bit today, whether that's you're just starting out and this is purely exploratory, you're sort of in the process of developing a strategy and understanding what are your material topics, or if you're a bit more advanced and you're continuously iterating on that program as well. So just as the responses come in, Tim, it seems most people are in those early stages. But yeah, over to you, Tim.
Excellent. And thanks, Tom, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure here to talk to you today about sustainability legislation in the Asia Pacific region. So the plan for today is we'll talk a little bit first about why are we facing a wave of sustainability legislation. So what are the drivers behind that? Then we'll go into the actual key sustainability legislation affecting countries in the Asia Pacific. And there's a bit of a disclaimer around there is that there's a lot happening in that space there. Our main focus today is really about looking at which jurisdictions are going to adopt or in the process of adopting the ISSB standards, also known as IFRS S1 and S2, which are on general S1, general sustainability disclosure requirements, and S2 on climate. So there might be other relevant sustainability legislation in your particular jurisdiction. So make sure always kind of really look at the requirements there. Our focus today is on that ISSB and give you the view of what is happening from that point of view. We'll touch, as Tom said, also on CSRD. That is European focused, but it's quite key as well to just put that on the radar and address that. After that, we'll look at the actions. So what are some strategic and compliance actions to stay ahead? So what are the first things to do? That altogether will take probably around 30 minutes. If you have any questions, like Tom said, put them in the chat. We'll get that at the end of the webinar. We'll leave some time for that. If there's a lot of questions, we'll get back to you individually. So first of all, the big question is, why are we facing that wave of sustainability legislation? Now, there are a couple of drivers there, and the most common drivers are governments really kind of feeling an urgency to address environmental challenges. It's about meeting international obligations, and it's about responding to societal expectations around more responsible business practices. So on that first area, that climate change, we all know that is really a priority and key focus area, environmental degradation. So what we see is a lot of the initial sustainability related legislation is actually climate regulation. It's about cutting carbon emissions. It's about transitioning to renewable energy, protecting natural ecosystems, avoiding pollution and waste, creating circular economy. So it's very much in the the E of ESG, the environmental side of things, and really focus about climate change as well. So that links back to that second standard that the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, has issued, IFRS S2, which is all about climate change. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail throughout this webinar. So climate is really a priority focus. And why is that? Well, we see there are global commitments and agreements that a lot of countries have signed up to. First and foremost, the Paris Agreement, which is all about cutting those greenhouse gas emissions. So a lot of companies are taking now steps going from commitments to actions, and the actions are often translated into policies and legislation, trying to just move jurisdictions forward in terms of cutting those carbon emissions. There are other agreements and other goals that we're working towards, countries. So for instance, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which is a broader framework, really focusing not just on environment, but on social and governance as well. More on the social side, with the International Bill of Human Rights, with the ILO conventions, labor agreements, the CITES, which is more on the environmental side, environmental degradation and protection there. So from a jurisdictional point of view, governments are really kind of trying to move from commitments to action as well, and trying to, in that, take the business community, with them and make sure that there are systems and mechanisms in place to see how companies are performing on, reaching certain targets and commitments that countries have made. And then finally, but not the least, is a really strong pressure, and that's been building now for some years, but it is still building, investor and consumer pressure. It's really about getting to more transparency at the corporate level, more accountability on a company's environmental and social impacts. It's really about creating more rigorous standards on ESG reporting, where previously there was a lot of voluntary reporting. Companies could decide what standards to use, what to report, how to report. That also led to a lot of fragmented ad hoc reporting, so no standardized reports. A lot of the ESG or sustainability reporting done was not so much kind of similar to financial reporting, which is rigorous, which is assured, which is standardized. It was more, let's call it marketing reporting to a degree. Definitely we had some good frameworks out there that helped us to move towards more of that rigorous reporting, things like TCFD on climate, GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative. But we're really now getting to a place where governments are saying, under pressure from investors and consumers, we want to really standardize that. And we do that through legislation, through compliance. Some of the key drivers there, but also from a corporate perspective, we can look at why it is so important to really identify from a sustainability point of view some of the impacts, the risks, and the opportunities you see in the real world that are sustainability related. So some of things from the kind of the news in the last few weeks and months there. It's a really good one about Porsche warning on profits. Flooding was hitting their aluminum suppliers in Germany. So we saw that there was a real kind of impact on the business there. A critical business dependency was affected by climate-related physical impacts there. And that really created a profit warning there. So this is all about that process of identifying from a sustainability point of view, what are the key impacts you're having on the world, but also the opposite of that. What are some dependencies that are critical to your business? What are the risks you're facing? Equally, we might see that companies, the second item here, companies drop certain commitments that they've made or change the way they do things, based often around misaligned stakeholder expectations. So in that realm where there was a lot of voluntary reporting, investors might ask for one thing, other stakeholders might ask for other things. There's no standardized reporting there, so people report all kinds of things. And by going through more legislated world in which we have really clear sets of data to report, we're going to avoid some of this work there. Other components as well, it's really important to look at finding business opportunities and some of the things you do that benefit nature and people. But keep in mind that triple bottom line there. Ideally, you just do the things you do to create better outcomes and benefits for people, planet, and profit. So that's really important. And also some key things where you can actually go above and beyond with your business model and drive, not just profit, but also create positive impacts. So there's some good corporate reasons as well to do this. And I want to bring this up is that we shouldn't see this sustainability legislation as just a compliance exercise, just a tick box exercise. It should really link back to your business model. It should link back to some of the things you're already doing about your enterprise risk management, about identifying opportunities for the business at large, about creating value, about a triple bottom line. So don't see that sustainability legislation in isolation from everything else. It will really help you move forward as a business. Now, the key question then is, what is that legislation that is affecting countries in the Asia Pacific? It's really useful to look at the different types of legislation and different types of policies that are out there. And what we see, we can put them in roughly 4 buckets there. The first one is the sustainable taxonomy, and that's really more around what are some criteria in which we can, that we've set to identify what type of activities we see as sustainable or as responsible. And that is, less reporting. That's more a guide for investors, for companies as well, for other stakeholders, consumers, to see what type of activities are classified in a particular jurisdiction as sustainable. Now, then when we go to the corporate climate disclosures, that's really clear. That is disclosures, that is reporting, but specifically on climate. On a broader set of disclosures, in a third box are the more general environmental, social, and governance disclosures. Again, that is reporting. And then the fourth one is we see a set of legislation as well around fund requirements. So think about asset management, about ESG funds that claim that they're green or clean or otherwise sustainable. We see more and more jurisdictions really putting clear rules in place there. When can you call a particular fund, a particular portfolio, any of those things? So today, we're really going to focus on those 2 in the middle there. It's about reporting what is affecting you as a company there from a climate perspective and from a sustainability ESG perspective. So how did we get here? I'm not going to take you through every step here, but it is good to have a quick look at this and think about how did ESG actually consolidate? How did it go mainstream? And more importantly, how did we move from what I flagged already, all this voluntary reporting, all these initiatives here that you see from 1997, pretty much up to only a few years back, or even today, you could argue, a lot of this was largely voluntary reporting. You would decide as a company to do it or not, and what you would do exactly. Now, we see that what has happened is that over time, some of these voluntary initiatives, what we see at the top there, CDP, CDSB, SASB, IR, and TCFD, they decided to all consolidate together under the IFRS Foundation into what they've set up in late 2021 at COP, the International Sustainability Standards Board, so the ISSB. That is really the driver for bringing a new global standard on sustainability reporting. So they created that. That has come out under the ISSB. So sometimes you hear people refer to that as the ISSB standards. Sometimes you hear it referred to as the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards. And sometimes you hear people refer to IFRS S1, which is that first standard on general sustainability disclosures, and IFRS S2, which is specifically on climate disclosures. So for simplicity's sake, today I'll be referring to it as the ISSB standards, which include those 2, the general sustainability and that climate standard. They've come out. Now, a key thing to realize there is there's still voluntary standards. It means that a lot of these voluntary things you see on this slide here consolidated in the ISSB. They've created, out of all the work that's been done over the years, a new set of global disclosure standards, but they're voluntary for companies to adopt if they want to, but more even so for countries, for jurisdictions to adopt. And that is what we're going to look at today. Those disclosure standards have been created are really the blueprint for global sustainability reporting. And by having them there, what jurisdictions can do is just directly implement them and say, we're going to ask companies in our jurisdiction to report on IFRS S1 and S2, or one of them initially. So without any modification, you can implement that directly. Now we'll see that some companies love to just give it their own flavor and localize them, as they call it. And we'll look at that in a minute. Another key initiative then is what the Europeans are doing. And they're really leading the way in terms of legislation. The Europeans have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD. And they have under that the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, the ESRS. They're really the reporting standards, whereas the CSRD is more the directive that tells you what to do, whereas in the standards, it's really specified how you need to do that. That is legislation that is applying to 50,000 companies in the European Union. But with that as well, it's key to keep in mind that that's something that also is potentially affecting foreign entities that have links to Europe. So for today, the most important thing from a legislation point of view is what the ISSB, the IFRS has done, but also to a degree, maybe less so for the Asia Pacific region, but it is good to really keep a close eye on that European legislation, but there is potential that might touch your business. So as I said, the European legislation there is mandated. So any company in Europe needs to do that. They need to just report every year now. That's being phased in. First companies already have started, mostly just as a trial to see if they're ready for that. Well, next year it's really kicking in. We see a lot more companies getting on board doing that. And like I said, the IFRS or ISSB standards are voluntary standards, but they may be mandated by your jurisdiction. So that's a key thing to look out for. And that's what we're going to look at today. Which of the jurisdictions in the Asia Pacific are actually implementing those ISSB standards? Where are they in the process? Who needs to report? What is the timeline? And is there any assurance required? So that's what we're going to walk you through today. It is good, like I said, to keep in mind what these standards are. They're built on existing standards that are already out there. So it's not brand new. They haven't made it up from scratch. The structure that a lot of these standards follow is based on the structure that was set forth in the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And that structure is pretty straightforward. It talks about governance first, then about strategy, then about risk management, and then asks you to disclose specific metrics and targets. So each of those ISSB standards, IFRS S1, S2, and they're working now on an S3 and an S4, they all follow that same structure there. S1 is, like I said, on general requirements for disclosure of sustainability-related financial information. Now, this is a key component here to realize is that companies need to disclose material information about sustainability-related risks and opportunities that they face over the short, medium, and long term. And this is really important. That could reasonably influence investor decisions. So what that means is the standards are really focused on what they call financial materiality. We're looking at the impacts the world at large has on the business. So what are the risks and opportunities that could affect your enterprise value in the short, medium, or long term? And we'll get to that difference. We'll get to that a bit later in this webinar, but it's important to realize that this is all about the impacts the world at large has on the business, financial materiality. The second one, S2, is about climate-related disclosures. And that is really about finding what are those climate-related risks and opportunities that could reasonably be expected to affect the entity's cash flow. So it's really about identifying climate-related physical and transition risks. So it's really important to look at that in detail under that standard. For both, you need to look at the materiality of it. So is something really crossing that threshold that it is really a priority for your business? So that means, in particular for S1, you need to do a materiality assessment, because sustainability could be many things across the E, the S, and the G. And you need to work out in a materiality assessment what actually is relevant to your business. So there will be, when I ask you to think about a ESG topic or sustainability topic, it could be anything. You could be thinking about under environment by GHG emissions, or environmental degradation. On the social, it could be about labor practices, about modern slavery, could be about about animal welfare, and on the governance, it could be about systems for cyber security. It could be tax transparency. It's a whole range of topics there. But what is really important to your business? Where are you facing risks and opportunities that are important enough that you need to report on? So that's important to keep in mind. So where are all these standards being implemented? So we see in blue here on the map, we've highlighted the countries in Europe that are affected by CSRD. So those companies there, about 50,000, need to follow that CSRD legislation. As I said, also, if you're not in Europe, but you do have operations or subsidiaries in Europe, keep an eye on that because you might be affected in a few years' time as well. So if we look at the red then, which is the most important, that is that implementation globally of the ISSB. We see 21 jurisdictions are working on that now. There's a lot more jurisdictions that have made commitments, but that might not have started the process there. So we see there's a good number of countries working on this. Now we're going to focus today on the Asia Pacific, and in the APAC, we see there's 12 jurisdictions that are in the process of doing that implementation of those voluntary ISSB standards and implementing them into their own jurisdiction and making them mandatory for companies reporting there. So what we're going to do is I'm going to run you through these countries here that are affected or basically implementing the ISSB standards. Now, I don't want to, for each country, go into a lot of detail there, but I do want to give you a quick overview and highlight some key areas. We'll share this deck with you so you can have a bit more in detail look at this. First off, a lot of this information being collected across the different jurisdictions. They're all of different bodies who do the implementation. So sometimes it's hard to source the information. Sometimes it might be in different languages. Sometimes there are contradicting ways about how people look at it. So some of this information might have changed. So we see there's constant updates there. So take this as a starting point, but really make sure that if any particular jurisdiction is relevant to you, to take this as a starting point, but then really look under the hood and find more of that information there. And you might find there's not a lot there. So we'll see some countries, it's pretty clear where they are and what they're doing. And we see other countries that have made very high level announcements, but not a lot of detail there. We know they're working on it, we just don't have the details yet. So any questions you have about these jurisdictions, feel free to ask them now or approach us later, but we might not have the answer because we just don't know yet. The market doesn't know yet. So alphabetically, but also because we expect a lot of Australian companies to be in this webinar today, we'll start with Australia first. Where we are is in terms of the adoption of those standards, it looks like we had a exposure draft that came out and that had a consultation around there. And that exposure draft was really focused on just localizing these standards. So taking those ISSB standards and making them own to Australia under the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards, the ASRS. Initially, it was really focused about kind of stripping down the IFRS S1 and only making it about climate, and then bringing S2 in as well as a climate standard. There was a lot of pushback because what we find is that if you really localize international standards too much, they're no longer standardized and comparable. So if you take that work that was done globally and really kind of pull it apart and do too much with it, when companies report on it, then you can't compare it to other jurisdictions anymore. So what we are today, it looks like that we'll implement IFRS S2, like the ASRS S2 climate standard, hopefully with not too many modifications. And we'll implement in Australia IFRS S1 as ASRS S1. But the key difference is that the climate standard S2 will be mandatory from the start, whereas S1, for the time being, it looks like it will be voluntary. There's a close interaction between S1 and S2. It doesn't mean you can't do them separately, but it was always intended as one, as a broad-based starting point, and then any more topic-based standards like S2 is on climate, S3 might be on another topic, and S4, etc., that are all kind of based as well on S1, which requires you to do that materiality assessment and work out what's important. So for now in Australia, it looks like that is the approach. The actual standards will hopefully be issued this month. It looked like they were on the timeline to be issued before the end of August. So any day now, we hope to see what the final standards look like. We'll see that the reporting entities require large entities that have to prepare and lodge under the Chapter 2M of the Corporation Act. So that includes listed and unlisted companies, financial institutions, registrable superannuation entities, and investment schemes. What is excluded for now is really small. There's certain thresholds, really small, kind of small, medium enterprises. It just depends if you fall under the threshold, and entities exempt from lodging financial report or AC&C registered. Again, really make sure, there's a lot of detail about this already, that you look for your specific situation as well, what applies to your business and what the timeline is. There will be staggered implementation with a phase-in from the 1st of January 2025. At least that is what it looks like. So it will be over a 4-year period to phase in 3 groups. So you might, if you're a small business, you might fall outside of that group. Keep in mind, even if you fall outside of this, is that companies that have to do this, have to do climate reporting, they might actually come back to you and ask you questions about, you're my supply chain, I need some climate related information from you. So that could happen. So what we generally suggest is that even if you're not directly kind of touched by this legislation, start early, because you might get stakeholders or people in your overall value chain that ask you for information. And we'll see that from an assurance point of view, reasonable assurance on all climate related disclosures, including scope 3 from the 4th year of reporting. That is what the situation looks like right now. That's why I put on the S1 in that column a question mark. It is there voluntary initially. I wouldn't be surprised that at some point it becomes mandated as well, but we'll have to see if and when that might happen. But it is really good practice to do that as well. So it's more recommended at this point than mandated. So that is the situation in Australia. If we look at Bangladesh, they're looking for a direct implementation of S1 and S2. So that means likely not going to localize, just going to say, these are the standards they're issued. The key thing that stands out here is that they're only doing it for banks and financial institutions. Implementation will be 2024 to 27, so over a 3-year period there, with limited assurance required in the annual report. In China, they're working on this as well, but they're really working more on different. They've structured it differently than the ISSB standard. So they've kind of taken it apart a little bit. They aim to align that first general sustainability disclosure standard, IFRS S1, with the Chinese domestic market characteristics. They want to use a double materiality lens. Now, remember when I flagged that earlier, the ISSB is financial materiality. It's about how does the world impact your business. Double materiality adds another lens to that. It asks you to also consider, how does your business impact the world, people and planet? So the Chinese are looking at how can we build that in there? And we'll get to that back a little bit later as well. That's a really important discussion to have. And they will have a standard as well on climate-related disclosure, but at this point, it's not clear yet if that is based on IFRS S2. So it looks like that S1 is going to be implemented in a slightly different way, but they are working on that. And S2, not sure yet. Again, a question mark there. Something on climate will be there, but we're not sure yet what it looks like yet. We'll see that the time frame there is, by 2027, they hope to have, climate-related disclosure standards, and by 2030, I hope to have a full kind of CSDS suite of reporting guidance and standards there being issued. So we have a few years there still, but work is in progress. In Hong Kong, we have a situation where there's we have the administrative region itself. They announced that they're developing a roadmap for the adoption of the ISSB standard. Not a lot of detail there. We know that they're working on a roadmap this year in 2024 to look at appropriate adoption of the ISSB standards. Now, it looks like that the Stock Exchange of Hong Kong thinks that's not going quick enough. So they're doing their own thing and already starting to implement some of this work. And they're looking at, they already have climate-related disclosures, but they want to move that closer, enhance that to really better reflect IFRS S2. So their new climate-related requirements will be phased in from 2025. So there's 2 processes happening there. So this is another thing that's really important as well. You really need to be across not just the jurisdiction. Sometimes there are other stakeholders. It could be your listing exchange as well that are implementing certain sustainability requirements, listing requirements that you need to adhere to. So keep a close eye on that. So Hong Kong is a great example of that. In Japan, we see that they actually have used IFRS S1 and S2 to create 3 standards. So they've taken S1 and kind of, taken it apart and made one part of it more what I call universal sustainability disclosure standard. And then part of S1 and S2 is more theme-based standard. So again, a good example of how a jurisdiction is localizing the ISSB standards. There's definitely sometimes criticism on that it's taking it too far away from the original standard. So is it still comparable? Can we still compare what companies are reporting? devil will be in the detail probably in terms of what are they taking it out, if they're just splitting it up or really making a lot of changes to disclosures as well. We see that standards are expected to be finalized in March next year with a consultation period already kind of that it just is closed now. So they're taking that consultation and moving that into the final standards and assurance 2027 or later. So there's definitely a process here ongoing that's really keen to, would be keen to follow and see how they're doing that in terms of making that into 3 standards. In South Korea, we see that they're doing a similar thing there. They're localizing it in a way. What they've done is they've created KSSB 1 and 2 as the counterparts to IFRS S1 and 2, but they also have a non-mandated disclosure standard KSSB 101, which is probably a bit more like a taxonomy or a key document that gives you some more localized information about particular requirements. So I think this approach probably stays a bit closer to the ISSB. They're kind of localizing, directly taking those 2 standards and creating the local versions of that with a additional document as well that provides you more kind of localized information. Implementation January 2026 or later, so we're still looking for a bit more detail on this. In Malaysia, we see that the consultation was launched, that are looking at first adopting IFRS S2, certain exemptions there for companies, so there's a bit of a phased-in approach there, and then introducing S1 the year after there, and ultimately having a full adoption of S1 and S2 from December 2027. So what they're looking for is really driving first with climate, because that is a key thing. And again, if we think about those drivers, climate commitments are on people's mind, government's minds a lot. So they really want to go first with S2 and then just a year later go to those more broad-based sustainability requirements by introducing S1. In Pakistan, not a lot of information, but they are looking at adopting S1 and S2. Looks like they're not going to do a localization there. It looks like it will be a direct implementation there. There will be thresholds there in terms of how companies will phase in. Thresholds will be based on pretty kind of standard, where we see a lot of jurisdictions, turnover, employee, total assets, and they will put you in a certain reporting group there between January 2025 and January 2027, with assurance starting from the 2nd year of reporting. In the Philippines, they're revising existing sustainability reporting guidelines for listed companies to kind of move towards that implementation of S1 and S2. So that is really, they already have something in place, but they want to align that with the global standards. And then ideally, pretty early already, January 2025, they hope to implement that. Now, a note on those timelines for all these jurisdictions is that sometimes that might be pushed out. So it already sounds like that is pretty early. We'll have to see if they make that timeline, but it's good to see that there's definitely ambition there to get these compliance requirements in place pretty soon. In Singapore, we see that mandatory climate-related disclosures being introduced there. So it's really about IFRS S2. There's not so much there on S1, so it's got a little cross there. It's really focused again on climate for listed and large non-listed companies. Starting to January 2025, and then kind of again having that threshold there. Similarly with assurance, that will kind of follow there from 2027 up to 2029 there. In Sri Lanka, they're looking at, again, localized versions of these standards. So they've done their own designation again. We'll have to look at how localized they are, but likely it's a similar way where they take IFRS S1 and S2 and make that into LFRS S1 and LFRS S2 with implementation again from January 2025, so pretty soon already, which should be pretty straightforward if they just take the existing standards and don't make too many changes there. And in Taiwan, we see that they're looking at adopting in full S1 and S2 for listed companies, a phase-in for mandatory adoption between January 26 to 28. So it looks like that will be not localized, will be taking the standards and just getting companies to start reporting on that, with assurance on scope 1 and scope 2 for listed companies from January 2029. So that's a really quick run through of all those jurisdictions. So hopefully that gives you some high-level overview that it is real, it is happening. Jurisdictions are all taking their own approach there, but we do see some commonalities, and we'll look at that. But this is all kind of coming in the next few years there. So the key takeaways or insights is that we'll see that a substantial number of jurisdictions are doing this, and we expect that more will follow. So this is probably the first wave of jurisdictions, but we really think more and more companies will be facing this in their own jurisdictions, if not already. There's different approaches there, what we've seen between that direct implementation versus a localized implementation. Where that localized, we see that particularly in Australia, South Korea, Japan, Sri Lanka. They're really looking at, how can we give it a local flavor for particular reasons. We see there's a difference in terms of implementation, where some go for both the general sustainability disclosures and climates all at once, S1 and S2, whereas other countries say, let's go with climate first or only. Australia, Singapore as examples. Or introduce that S1 a bit later in the game. And I think for most countries that is probably the case, that they either not use S1 immediately or make it voluntary or come a bit later with that as a mandatory reporting requirement. There's some detail here and there about assurance requirements. It can be quite different, can be a bit unclear there still as well. So that is something we expect more detail on as well. The phased-in reporting pathways, we see a lot of them, as I've flagged, starting next year already from 1st of January, some starting 2026. It is pretty quick and pretty soon that these things are kicking off. So that's why it's really important to move today. Even if you're affected in a group that might be in 26 or 27, it is really good practice to start now, because you'll find it's a lot of work initially, that first year, to just really get a grip on what you need to do and how you need to do that. And finally, then, to before we start wrapping up, it's really interesting to see there's a discussion now. We flagged that a lot of this reporting from the ISSB standard that's being implemented is focused on financial materiality. It's about your risks and opportunities as a business. But there's also, we see a lot of companies have already been reporting on the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, which is the opposite, which is what is the impact we're as a business having on the world. And all that reporting, I think in Japan, out of the top 100 companies, 90% there is already reporting on a voluntary basis, but fully aligned with GRI. So the question that GRI is asking the Japanese Sustainability Board is, great if you're implementing the ISSB with that single financial materiality focus, but most companies are already reporting as well on impact. So can't we take that perspective as well and really include that? So this is a good kind of description here, there, where you see the difference. In Europe, they've just said, you need to do double materiality. We want to understand when you report what your impacts are on the world, but also how the world is impacting you. So you need to do both. We see that if you're reporting with GRI, you're really reporting on those impacts you're having. If you're reporting on the ISSB or the IFRS S1, S2, you're reporting on financial materiality. And the big discussion now for all these jurisdictions that we just ran through is, are they just going to stay with financial materiality? We see that at least China is saying, we're going to restructure the ISSB, which we believe we should be reporting on double materiality. They're probably taking a hint here from Europe. GRI is saying the same thing. Hey, Europeans are really the standard setters here. They're looking at double materiality. That is something everyone should be doing. So they are engaging now with Japan, Australia. There's a few other jurisdictions where they're really having that conversation around, maybe you do need to look at that other side as well. Impact materiality is really important because it generally uncovers a lot more different risks and opportunities as well that you might not otherwise uncover. So that's a really key conversation that's happening at the moment. So that's something we're watching. The key takeaway from that will probably be, is if you start doing the ISSB, IFRS, keep in mind that if you're already doing GRI reporting, maybe use that as well to inform some of the work you're doing there. And whenever you're doing GRI, don't just throw that out. It will not just be replaced by ISSB. Generally, what we'll see over time, it will come together like what they have in Europe. So keep doing the GRI reporting if you're already doing that. And if you then have to do that ISSB, IFRS reporting on the ISSB standard to your jurisdiction, generally that will be a good complement there to what you're already doing for GRI reporting. And then to round it up, like, what are some actions and things to do? Really at a high level, what we find is that it's really important to really review in detail what your jurisdiction require. We had a look at those localized or those ISSB standards and what's happening there in the Asia Pacific, but also look at some other sustainability related requirements. Like in Australia, we have NGAR reporting, which is carbon accounting, carbon reporting for large companies. And across the Asia Pacific, there are different already, like New Zealand already has climate reporting in place there. So there are other sustainability requirements. So make sure you're aware of everything. Look at when compliance requirements kick in. Like I said, even if it sounds like it's already 2027 that you only have to report to, it sounds like that's very far away, but it's not. And you'll see that a lot of other companies will start this process, and they might, in particular on climate, come back and ask you questions. You might see if other companies do it, and investors ask that information from you as well. So it is really sensible to not sit back and relax. Don't wait for that phase in to catch up with you. Be proactive and start today is really key. And also review when you are touched, if and when, by the European legislation. So have a look at that. If you have any relationships, subsidiaries in Europe, really have a close review of that if that ever will hit you. Most legislation will require materiality assessment on some shape or form. It could be financial. If you're doing the ISSB financial materiality, if you do GRI, it could be GRI is impact-based. Europeans are doing that. Double materiality assessment. The ISSB IFRS S1 requires you to do a financial materiality assessment to work out which topics actually pose those risks and opportunities to your business. So that is generally, for most legislation, a really good starting point. Work out what you need to report on, what are your reporting requirements, and based on that, identify the right type of materiality assessment. And if you want to be, complete, do a double materiality assessment to really work out what are those sustainability issues that are relevant and really a priority or material to you in terms of your reporting. But it also feeds into your strategy setting and your operational improvements there to make sure that you move that reporting forward. So with that, I think we've come to the end of the webinar. I'm going to ask Tom to just jump on as well and see if there's any questions that have come up. In terms of your journey, what we often see is, like I said, it's really important in that first phase of your journey to really look at that materiality, get the relevant topics, build internal support, and feed that into your strategies, the actions you take, because ultimately at the end of that journey, and this is mostly your annual journey, you'll have to provide outputs. You have to report your disclosures to either ISSB, IFRS, GRI, CSRD. There's a lot of these kind of requirements now where those outputs need to come out. When you just come in and just look at number 5 there alone, it's hard to work it all out. So what we see most companies go through that process there, where they work out material topics and work out the support, the strategy, the actions they need to take to get to that reporting and inform that. With that, I'll hand it over back to you, Tom.
Thanks, Tim. Really informative, and hopefully that provided a lot of clarity to people on the call. We've got one question in the chat box, but I'd like to open up to the floor for anybody else just to pop any questions into the chat box. But first question from Michael, Tim, is that you mentioned New Zealand already has climate reporting in place. Is this based on GRI, IFRS, ISSB?
Great question. So New Zealand was one of the first to really mandate climate reporting. The ISSB IFRS standards S2 is on climate, but effectively you could say what they've done is they haven't, like I said, reinvented the wheel. What they did is they said, well, there's a great climate reporting framework out there, which many people will probably know as TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It's been around for a while there. It's a set of recommendations, voluntary for companies to report on their climate-related financial risks and opportunities. That is what New Zealand has used as their framework to create their own climate reporting. So TCFD has been implemented there. But also TCFD is the cornerstone. It's been kind of merged into what we saw earlier, merged into the IFRS ISSB. So TCFD sits there now, and effectively you could say that IFRS S2 is TCFD in a lot of shapes and forms.
Perfect, thanks, Tim. A couple of the questions that have come in, one from Molesh, I think that's how you pronounce it, apologies if not. asking about how a big miner is approaching reporting standards within Australia. And obviously we've worked with a lot of companies in that sector, so we can provide some light on that.
Great question again. I think like really the big guys, what we find is they have done already a lot of reporting. So in Australia in particular, the big miners, they'll be doing NGAR reporting, which is a mandated carbon reporting, GHG reporting in Australia. So if you really go over certain thresholds, and a lot of the big miners likely will, you have to do that annual NGAR reporting on your carbon emissions. In terms of the other reporting they do, likely a lot of them will do some of those voluntary standards. Over time, they'll find ways to do that. So most of the miners, probably the big ones, will be doing TCFD. They'll be doing GRI reporting. They might have been reporting on SASB, which also merged into the IFRS. So there will be a lot of those standards. GRI has specific sector standards as well, so they'll be looking at the mining standard there that they're reporting on. The same for SASB, they have particular standards for sectors with material topics that you can report on. So a lot of them will be doing some of that voluntary reporting and some of the mandated sustainability legislation and compliance requirements already out there, although it's not a lot from that for that matter.
Perfect. Just conscious of time. No, we've come up to time, but there's a few other questions. For anybody that we don't get through to, we'll reach out afterwards and sort of answer your questions. But the next one was from Lily in regards to when are the Australian standards released this month? How are we going to be able to access them?
Yeah, so the standard, so there's a process in Australia around the ASRS. There's the actual kind of bill that's with Parliament. What it means is like they need to just approve that. And that means that it's all happening and what shape and form that's happening in. Who are the entities that need to report, etc. But the how more, like what do the actual standards look like? The Australian Accounting Standards Board, the AASB, are creating those standards. They're working on that right now. So like I flagged earlier in the webinar, they've created an exposure draft earlier. They had consultation, feedback. Now they've kind of, I wouldn't say they've thrown it entirely out there, but they've come back. There's a lot of feedback. And they've kind of announced that they're going to take a slightly different approach, slightly more to that direct implementation. They flagged with that they were aiming to get those standards out. So we expect those standards to be publicly available, hopefully this month, if not later, most likely on the ASB's website. When it's out there, I expect that you'll see that shared across the internet as well on a lot of law firms, sustainability consultancies, on LinkedIn. It likely will be a big deal when it's out there. So I would say if you keep half an eye on the sustainability space, you'll probably see them when they come out.
Yeah, I'd recommend anybody as well just to follow Social Suite on LinkedIn if you haven't already. We're always posting webinars, educational content, and it's certainly something that we would release once it's released to the public as well. So highly recommend to do that. Probably just take a couple more. I know, Mitch, you've asked about double materiality assessment. Social Suite actually focuses and helps organizations through that process. We have technology and advisory to do that, so we can reach out and sort of go through that process in more depth, or feel free to just book a meeting in the calendar using that link in the chat box, and that goes for anybody else that might be interested across that as well. I might just go to Bernie as the final question. He's just asking about what action this reporting will drive from regulators. Yeah,
so what we'll see is that it will be mandated, and that means that you'll have to start following those rules. There will be a level of assurance around that as well. So it become part and parcel of your reporting. It will be specified as well where you need to start reporting this. So what it really means is that there's a lot more guidance around, well, kind of instructions, you could say, around what you need to do, how you need to do it, where it's expected to be published, how it needs to be assured. So you have to just follow those steps there. And that is what it makes it so different from initial voluntary reporting, where everyone could do whatever they wanted. It could live in any shape or form as a impact ESG sustainability report. It could live in separate locations with whatever information you wanted. It's now a lot more standardized and clear. So when the final legislation is approved in Parliament and the standards are available, we'll have the final detail on that. and ultimately then that will be hopefully be enforced by the regulators in terms of the work you need to do. There will always be some kind of, generally be some kind of mitigation around that, and there will be phase-ins, and there will be pathways to make sure that companies are, doing it in a proportional way. So that's why the thresholds are introduced. Particularly, we'll see in the first years, the larger companies starting with this would generally have a bit more already a bit more progress in that sustainability journey, expertise, capability. They'll be the first to report. So if you're a smaller company, you can learn from them. Look at the reporting they've done, how they approach that. So they'll be the first to do that. We see that happening right now in Europe. The large companies are getting started with CSRD, and the smaller ones learning and picking up. And even with that in Europe, same thing there. We see that companies are not getting it right. It's not about being perfect. It's about making an effort, and it's about being transparent and accountable about what you're doing, where you feel you can improve next year. And that is where regulators generally will look at. You're making a real, genuine effort to do this reporting. You might not have all the information. You are aware of where your weaknesses are, and you are kind of making commitments to improve that over time.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Hopefully that answers the question, Bernie. I think that's come up to time. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending. As Tim mentioned earlier, we will follow up by sending out the slides as well as the recording link as well. Do check your spam just with a few additional links on those emails. They can sometimes go into the spam box, so do check those for the slides as well. But any other questions, feel free to reach out. But thanks for everyone's time, and hope you have a good rest of the day.